The Monster of the Prophecy by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 1. A dismal, fog-dank afternoon was turning into a murky twilight when Theophilus Alvor paused on Brooklyn Bridge to peer down at the dim river with a shudder of sinister surmise. He was wondering how it would feel to cast himself into the chill, turbid waters, and whether he could summon up the necessary courage for an act which, he had persuaded himself, was now becoming inevitable as well as laudable. He felt that he was too weary, sick, and disheartened to go on with the evil dream of existence. From any standpoint, there was doubtless abundant reason for Alvor's depression. Young and full of unquenched visions and desires, he had come to Brooklyn from an upstate village 3 months before, hoping to find a publisher for his writings. But his old-fashioned classic verses, in spite, or because, of their high imaginative fire, had been unanimously rejected, both by magazines and book firms. Though Alvor had lived frugally, and had chosen lodgings so humble as almost to constitute the proverbial poetic garret, the small sum of his savings was now exhausted. He was not only quite penniless, but his clothes were so worn as to be no longer presentable in editorial offices, and the soles of his shoes were becoming rapidly non-existent from the tramping he had done. He had not eaten for days, and his last meal, like the several preceding ones, had been at the expense of his soft-hearted Irish landlady. For more reasons than one, Alvor would have preferred another death than that of drowning. The foul and icy waters were not inviting from an aesthetic viewpoint, and in spite of all he had heard to the contrary, he did not believe that such a death could be anything but painful and disagreeable. By choice, he would have selected a sovereign oriental opiate, whose insidious slumber would have led through a realm of gorgeous dreams to the gentle night of an ultimate oblivion. Or, failing this, a deadly poison of merciful swiftness. But such Lethean media are not readily obtainable by a man with an empty purse. Damning his own lack of forethought in not reserving enough money for such an eventuation, Alvor shuddered on the twilight bridge and looked at the dismal waters, and then at the no less dismal fog through which the troubled lights of the city had begun to break, and then, through the instinctive habit of a country-bred person who is also imaginative and beauty-seeking, he looked at the heavens above the city to see if any stars were visible. He thought of his recent Ode to Antares, which, unlike his earlier productions, was written in vers libre, and had a strong modernistic irony mingled with its planturous lyricism. It had, however, proved as unsellable as the rest of his poems. Now, with the sense of irony far more bitter than that which he had put into his ode, he looked for the ruddy spark of Antares itself, but was unable to find it in the sodden sky. His gaze and his thoughts returned to the river. "There is no need for that, my young friend," said a voice at his elbow. Alvor was startled not only by the words and by the clairvoyance they betrayed, but also by something that was unanalyzably strange in the tones of the voice that uttered them. The tones were both refined and authoritative, but in them there was a quality which, for lack of more precise words or imagery, he could think of only as metallic and unhuman. While his mind wrestled with swift-born, unseizable fantasies, he turned to look at the stranger who had accosted him. The man was neither uncommonly nor disproportionately tall, and he was modishly dressed with a long overcoat and top hat. His features were not unusual from what could be seen of them in the dusk, except for his full-lidded and burning eyes, like those of some nyctalopic animal. But from him there emanated a palpable sense of things that were inconceivably strange and terrifying and remote, a sense that was more patent more insistent than any impression of mere form and odor and sound could have been, and which was well nigh tactual in its intensity. "I repeat," continued the man, "that there is no necessity for you to drown yourself in that river. A vastly different fate can be yours if you choose. In the meanwhile, I shall be honored and delighted if you will accompany me to my house, which is not far away." In a daze of astonishment, preclusive of all analytical thought, or even of any clear cognizance of where he was going or what was happening, Alvor followed the stranger for several blocks in the swirling fog. Hardly knowing how he had come there, he found himself in the library of an old house, which must in its time have had considerable pretensions to aristocratic dignity, for the paneling, carpet, and furniture were all antique, and were both rare and luxurious. The poet was left alone for a few minutes in the library. Then his host reappeared and led him to a dining-room, where an excellent meal for two had been brought in from a neighboring restaurant. Alvor, who was faint with inanition, ate with no attempt to conceal his ravening appetite, but noticed that the stranger made scarcely even a pretense of touching his own food. With a manner preoccupied and distrait, the man sat opposite Alvor, giving no more ostensible heed to his guest than the ordinary courtesies of a host required. "We will talk now," said the stranger when Alvor had finished. The poet, whose energies and mental faculties had been revived by the food, became bold enough to survey his host with a frank attempt at appraisal. He saw a man of indefinite age, whose lineaments and complexion were Caucasian, but whose nationality he was unable to determine. The eyes had lost something of their weird luminosity beneath the electric light, but nevertheless they were most remarkable, and from them there poured a sense of unearthly knowledge and power and strangeness, not to be formulated by human thought, or conveyed in human speech. Under his scrutiny, vague, dazzling, intricate, unshapeable images rose on the dim borders of the poet's mind, and fell back into oblivion ere he could confront them. Apparently, without rhyme or reason, some old lines in his Ode to Antares returned to him, and he found that he was repeating them over and over beneath his breath. "Star of strange hope, Pharos beyond our desperate mire, Lord of unscalable gulfs, lamp of unknowable life." The hopeless, half-satiric yearning for another sphere, which he had expressed in this poem, haunted his thoughts with a weird insistence. "Of course you have no idea who or what I am," said the stranger, "though your poetic intuitions are groping darkly toward the secret of my identity. On my part, there is no need for me to ask you anything, since I have already learned all there is to learn about your life, your personality, and your dismal predicament, from which I am now able to offer you a means of escape. Your name is Theophilus Alvor, and you are a poet whose classic style and romantic genius are not likely to win adequate recognition in this age and land. With an inspiration more prophetic than you dream, you have written, among other masterpieces, a quite admirable Ode to Antares." "How do you know all this?" cried Alvor. "To those who have the sensory apparatus with which to perceive them, thoughts are no less audible than spoken words. I can hear your thoughts, so you will readily understand that there is nothing surprising in my possession of more or less knowledge concerning you." "But who are you?" exclaimed Alvor. "I have heard of people who could read minds of others, but I did not believe that there was any human being who actually possessed such powers." "I am not a human being," rejoined the stranger, "even though I have found it convenient to don the semblance of one for a while, just as you or another of your race might wear a masquerade costume. Permit me to introduce myself. My name, as nearly as can be conveyed in the phonetics of your world, is Visafmal, and I have come from a planet of the far-off mighty sun that is known to you as Antares. In my own world I am a scientist, though the more ignorant classes look upon me as a wizard. In the course of profound experiments and researches, I have invented a device which enables me at will to visit other planets, no matter how remote in space. I have sojourned for varying intervals in more than one solar system, and I have found your world and its inhabitants so quaint and curious and monstrous that I have lingered here a little longer than I intended, because of my taste for the bizarre. A taste which is ineradicable, though no doubt reprehensible. It is now time for me to return. Urgent duties call me, and I cannot tarry. But there are reasons why I should like to take with me to my world a member of your race, and when I saw you on the bridge tonight, it occurred to me that you might be willing to undertake such an adventure. You are, I believe, utterly weary of the sphere in which you find yourself, since a little while ago you were ready to depart from it into the unknown dimension that you call death. I can offer you something much more agreeable and diversified than death, with a scope of sensation, a potentiality of experience, beyond anything of which you have had even the faintest intimation in the poetic reveries looked upon as extravagant by your fellows. Again and again, while listening to this long and singular address, Alvor seemed to catch in the tones of the voice that uttered it a supervening resonance, a vibration of overtones beyond the compass of a mortal throat. Though perfectly clear and correct in all details of enunciation, there was a hint of vowels and consonants not to be found in any terrestrial alphabet. However, the logical part of his mind refused to accept entirely these intimations of the supermundane, and he was now seized by the idea that the man before him was some new type of lunatic. "Your thought is natural enough, considering the limitations of your experience," observed the stranger calmly. "However, I can easily convince you of its error by revealing myself to you in my true shape." He made the gesture of one who throws off a garment. Alvor was blinded by an insufferable blaze of light, whose white glare, emanating in huge beams from an orb-like center, filled the entire room and seemed to pass illimitably beyond through dissolving walls. When his eyes became accustomed to the light, he saw before him a being who had no conceivable likeness to his host. This being was more than 7 feet in height, and had no less than 5 intricately jointed arms and 3 legs that were equally elaborate. His head, on a long, swan-like neck, was equipped not only with visual, auditory, nasal, and oral organs of unfamiliar types, but had several appendages whose use was not readily to be determined. His 3 eyes, obliquely set and with oval pupils, rayed forth a green phosphorescence. The mouth, or what appeared to be such, was very small, and had the lines of a downward curving crescent. The nose was rudimentary, though with finely wrought nostrils. In lieu of eyebrows, he had a triple series of semicircular markings on his forehead, each of a different hue, and above his intellectually shapen head, above the tiny drooping ears with their complex lobes, there towered a gorgeous comb of crimson, not dissimilar in form to the crest on the helmet of a Grecian warrior. The head, the limbs, and the whole body were mottled with interchanging lunes and moons of opalescent colors, never the same for a moment in their unresting flux and reflux. Alvor had the sensation of standing on the rim of prodigious gulfs, on a new earth beneath new heavens, and the vistas of illimitable horizons, fraught with the multitudinous terror and manifold beauty of an imagery no human eye had ever seen, hovered and wavered and flashed upon him with the same unstable fluorescence as the lunar variegations of the body at which he stared with such stupefaction. Then, in a little while, the strange light seemed to withdraw upon itself, retracting all its beams to a common center, and faded in a whirl of darkness. when this darkness had cleared away, he saw once more the form of his host, in conventional garb, with a slight ironic smile about his lips. "Do you believe me now?" Philosopher queried. "Yes, I believe you." "Are you willing to accept my offer?" "I accept it." 1,000 questions were forming in Alvor's mind, but he dared not ask them. Divining these questions, the stranger spoke as follows. "You wonder how it is possible for me to assume a human shape. I assure you it is merely a matter of taking thought. My mental images are infinitely clearer and stronger than those of any earth being, and by conceiving myself as a man, I can appear to you and your fellows as such. You wonder also as to the modus operandi of my arrival on earth. This I shall now show and explain to you, if you will follow me." He led the way to an upper story of the old mansion. Here, in a sort of attic, beneath a large skylight and the southward sloping roof, there stood a curious mechanism, wrought of a dark metal which Alvor could not identify. It was a tall, complicated framework, with many transverse bars and 2 stout upright rods, terminating at each end in a single heavy disc. These discs seemed to form the main portions of the top and bottom. "Put your hands between the bars," commanded Alvor's host. Alvor tried to obey this command, but his fingers met with an adamantine obstruction, and he realized that the intervals of the bars were filled with an unknown material, clearer than glass or crystal. "You behold here," said Philosopher, "an invention which, I flatter myself, is quite unique anywhere this side of the galactic suns. The discs at top and bottom are a vibratory device with a 2-fold use, and no other material than that of which they are wrought would have the same properties, the same achievable rates of vibration. When you and I have locked ourselves within the framework, as we shall do anon, a few revolutions of the lower disc will have the effect of isolating us from our present environment, and we shall find ourselves in the midst of what is known to you as space, or ether. The vibrations of the upper disc, which we shall then employ, are of such potency as to annihilate space itself in any direction desired. Space, like everything else in the atomic universe, is subject to laws of integration and dissolution. It was merely a matter of finding the vibrational power that would effect this dissolution, and by untiring research, by ceaseless experimentation, I located and isolated the rare metallic elements which, in a state of union, are capable of this power." While the poet was pondering all he had seen and heard, Philosopher touched a tiny knob, and one side of the framework swung open. He then turned off the electric light in the garret, and simultaneously with its extinction, a ruddy glow was visible in the interior of the machine, serving to illuminate all the parts, but leaving the room around it in darkness. Standing beside his invention, Philosopher looked at the skylight, and Alvor followed his gaze. The fog had cleared away, and many stars were out, including the red gleam of Antares, now high in the south. The stranger was evidently making certain preliminary calculations, for he moved the machine a little after peering at the star, and adjusted a number of fine wires in the interior, as if he were tuning some stringed instrument. At last he turned to Alvor. "Everything is now in readiness," he announced. "If you are still prepared to accompany me, we will take our departure." Alvor was conscious of an unexpected coolness and fortitude as he answered, "I am at your service." The unparalleled occurrences and disclosures of the evening, the well-nigh undreamable imminence of a plunge across untold immensitude, such as no man had been privileged to dare before, had really benumbed his imagination, and he was unable at the moment to conceive the true awesomeness of what he had undertaken. Philosopher indicated the place where Alvor was to stand in the machine. The poet entered and assumed a position between one of the upright rods and the side, opposite Visafmal. He found that a layer of the transparent material was interposed between his feet and the large disc in which the rods were based. No sooner had he stationed himself than, with a celerity and an utter silence that were uncanny, the framework closed upon itself with hermetic tightness, till the jointure where it had opened was no longer detectable. "We are now in a sealed compartment," explained the Antarian, "into which nothing can penetrate. Both the dark metal and the crystalline are substances that refuse the passage of heat and cold, of air and ether, or of any known cosmic ray, with the one exception of light itself, which is emitted by the clear metal." When he ceased, Alvor realized that they were walled about with an insulating silence, utter and absolute as that of some intersidereal void. The traffic in the streets without, the rumbling and roaring and jarring of the great city, so loud a minute before, might have been 1,000,000 miles away, in some other world, for all that he could hear or feel of its vibration. In the red glow that pervaded the machine, emanating from a source he could not discover, the poet gazed at his companion. Visafmal had now resumed his Antarian form, as if all necessity for a human disguise were at an end, and he towered above Alvor, glorious with intermerging zones of fluctuant colors, where hues the poet had not seen in any spectrum were simultaneous or intermittent with flaming blues and coruscating emeralds and amethysts and fulgurant purples and vermilions and saffrons. Lifting one of his 5 arms, which terminated in 2 finger-like appendages with many joints all capable of bending in any direction, the Antarian touched a thin wire that was stretched overhead between the 2 rods. He plucked at this wire like a musician at a lute string, and from it there emanated a single clear note, higher in pitch than anything Alvor had ever heard. Its sheer, unearthly acuity caused a shudder of anguish to run through the poet, and he could scarcely have borne a prolongation of the sound, which, however, ceased in a moment, and was followed by a much more endurable humming and singing noise, which seemed to arise at his feet. Looking down, he saw that the large disc at the bottom of the medial rods had begun to revolve. This revolution was slow at first, but rapidly increased in its rate, till he could no longer see the movement, and the singing sound became agonizingly sweet and high, till it pierced his senses like a knife. Visafmal touched a second wire, and the revolution of the disc was brought abruptly to an end. Alvor felt an unspeakable relief at the sensation of the torturing music. "We are now out in etheric space," the Antarian declared. "Look out, if you so desire." Alvor peered through the interstices of the dark metal, and saw around and above and below them the unlimited blackness of cosmic night, and the teeming of uncountable trillions of stars. He had a sensation of frightful and deadly vertigo, and staggered like a drunken man as he tried to keep himself from falling against the side of the machine. Visafmal plucked at a 3rd wire, but this time Alvor was not aware of any sound. Something that was like an electric shock, and also like the crushing impact of a heavy blow, descended upon his head and shook him to the soles of his feet. Then he felt as if his tissues were being stabbed by innumerable needles of fire, and then that he was being torn apart in 1,000,000 fragments, bone by bone, muscle by muscle, vein by vein, and nerve by nerve, on some invisible rack. He swooned and fell huddled in a corner of the machine, but his unconsciousness was not altogether complete. He seemed to be drowning beneath an infinite sea of darkness, beneath the accumulation of shoreless gulfs, and above this sea, so far away that he lost it again and again, there thrilled a supernal melody, sweet as the singing of sirens or the fabled music of the spheres, together with an insupportable dissonance like the shattering of all the battlements of time. He thought that all his nerves had been elongated to an enormous distance when the outlying parts of himself were being tortured in the oubliettes of fantastic inquisitions by the use of instruments of percussion, diabolically vibrant, that were somehow identified with certain of his own body cells. Once he thought that he saw a visafmal standing 1,000,000 leagues remote on the shore of an alien planet, with the sky of soaring, many-colored flame behind him, and a night of all the universe rippling gently at his feet like a submissive ocean. Then he lost the vision, and the intervals of the far unearthly music became more prolonged, and at last he could not hear it at all, nor could he feel any longer the torturing of his remote nerve ends. The gulf deepened above him, and he sank through aeons of darkness and emptiness to the very nadir of oblivion. Chapter 2. Alvor's return to consciousness was even more slow and gradual than his descent into Lethe had been. Still lying at the bottom of a shoreless and boundless night, he became aware of an unidentifiable odor, with which in some way the sense of ardent warmth was associated. This odor changed incessantly, as if it were composed of many diverse ingredients, each of which predominated in turn. Myrrh-like and mystic in the beginning, as the fumes of an antique altar, it assumed the heavy languor of unimaginable flowers, the sharp sting of vaporizing chemicals unknown to science, the smell of exotic water and exotic earth, and then a medley of other elements that conveyed no suggestion of anything whatever, except of revolutionary realms and ranges that were beyond all human experience or calculation. For a while he lived and was awake only in a sensory response to this potpourri of odors. Then the awareness of his own corporeal being came back to him through tactual sensations of an unusual order, which he did not at first recognize as being within himself, but which seemed to be those of a foreign entity in some other dimension, with whom he was connected across unbridgeable gulfs by a nexus of gossamer tenuity. This entity, he thought, was reclining on a material of great softness, into which he sank with a supreme and leaden indolence, and a feeling of sheer bodily weight that held him utterly motionless. Then, floating along the ebon cycles of the void, this being came with ineffable slowness toward Alvor, and at last, by no perceptible transition, by no breach of physical logic or mental congruity, was incorporate with him. Then a tiny light, like a star burning all alone in the center of infinitude, began to dawn far off, and it drew nearer and nearer, and grew larger and larger, till it turned the black void to a dazzling luminescence, to a many-tinted glory that smote full upon Alvor. He found that he was lying with wide-open eyes on a huge couch, in a sort of pavilion, consisting of a low and elliptical dome supported on double rows of diagonally fluted pillars. He was quite naked, though a sheet of some thin and pale yellow fabric had been thrown across his lower limbs. He saw at a glance, even though his brain centers were still half benumbed as by the action of some opiate, that this fabric was not the product of any terrestrial loom. Beneath his body, the couch was covered with gray and purple stuffs, but whether they were made of feathers, fur, or cloth, he was altogether uncertain, for they suggested all three of these materials. They were very thick and resilient, and accounted for the sense of extreme softness underneath him that had marked his return from the swoon. The couch itself stood higher above the floor than an ordinary bed, and was also longer, and in his half-narcoticized condition, this troubled Alvor even more than other aspects of his situation, which were far less normal and explicable. Amazement grew upon him as he looked about with reviving faculties, for all that he saw and smelt and touched was totally foreign and unaccountable. The floor of the pavilion was wrought in a geometric marquetry of ovals, rhomboids, and equilaterals, in white, black, and yellow materials that no earthly mind had ever disclosed, and the pillars were of the same three metals, regularly alternating. The dome alone was entirely of yellow. Not far from the couch there stood on a squat tripod a dark and wide-mouthed vessel from which poured an opalescent vapor. Someone standing behind it, invisible through the cloud of gorgeous fumes, was fanning the vapor toward Alvor. He recognized it as the source of the myrrh-like odor that had first troubled his reanimating senses. It was quite agreeable, but was borne away from him again and again by gusts of hot wind, which brought into the pavilion a mixture of perfumes that were both sweet and acrid, and were altogether novel. Looking between the pillars, he saw the monstrous heads of towering blossoms, with pagoda-like tiers of sultry, sullen petals, and beyond them a terraced landscape of low hills of mauve and naccarat soil, extending toward a horizon incredibly remote, till they rose and rose against the heavens. Above all this was a whitish sky, filled with a blinding radiation of intense light from a sun that was now hidden by the dome. Alvor's eyes began to ache, the odors disturbed and oppressed him, and he was possessed by a terrible dubiety and perplexity, amid which he remembered vaguely his meeting with Visafmal, and the events preceding his swoon. He was unbearably nervous, and for some time all his ideas and sensations took on the painful disorder and irrational fears of incipient delirium. A figure stepped from behind the veering vapors and approached the couch. It was Visafmal, who bore in one of his 5 hands the large, thin, circular fan of bluish metal he had been using. He was holding in another hand a tubular cup, half full of an erubescent liquid. "Drink this," he ordered as he put the cup to Alvor's lips. The liquid was so bitter and fiery that Alvor could swallow it only in sips, between periods of gasping and coughing. But once he had gotten it down, his brain cleared with celerity, and all his sensations were soon comparatively normal. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice sounded very strange and unfamiliar to him, and its effect bordered upon ventriloquism, which, as he afterward learned, was due to certain peculiarities of the atmospheric medium. "You are on my country estate, in Ulfalor, a kingdom which occupies the whole northern hemisphere of Sarabor, the inmost planet of Sonarda, that sun which is called Antares in your world. You have been unconscious for 3 of our days, a result which I anticipated, knowing the profound shock your nervous system would receive from the experience through which you have passed. However, I do not think you will suffer any permanent illness or inconvenience, and I have just now administered to you a sovereign drug, which will aid all the adjustment of your nerves and your corporeal functions to the novel conditions under which you are to live henceforward. I employed the opalescent vapor to arouse you from your swoon, when I deemed that it had become safe and wise to do this. The vapor is produced by the burning of an aromatic seaweed that is magisterial in its restorative effect." Alvor tried to grasp the full meaning of this information, but his brain was still unable to receive anything more than a melange of impressions that were totally new and obscure and outlandish. As he pondered the words of Visafmal, he saw that rays of bright light had fallen between the columns and were creeping across the floor. Then the rim of a vast ember-colored sun descended below the rim of the dome, and he felt an overwhelming, but somehow not insupportable, warmth. His eyes no longer ached, not even in the direct beams of this luminary, nor did the perfumes irritate him, as they had done for a while. "I think," said Visafmal, "that you may now arise. It is afternoon, and there is much for you to learn, and much to be done." Alvor threw off the thin covering of yellow cloth, and sat up, with legs hanging over the edge of the couch. "But my clothing?" he queried. "You will need none in our climate. No one has ever worn anything of the sort in Sadabor." Alvor digested this idea, and though he was slightly disconcerted, he made up his mind that he would accustom himself to whatever should be required of him. Anyway, the lack of his usual habiliments was far from disagreeable in the dry, sultry air of this new world. He slid from the couch to the floor, which was nearly 5 feet below him, and took several steps. He was not weak or dizzy, as he had half expected, but all his movements were characterized by the same sense of extreme bodily weight, of which he had been dimly aware while still in a semi-conscious condition. "The world in which you now dwell is somewhat larger than your own," explained Visafmal, "and the force of gravity is proportionately greater. Your weight has been increased by no less than 1/3, but I think you will soon become habituated to this, as well as to other novelties of your situation." Motioning the poet to follow him, he led the way through that portion of the pavilion which had been behind Alvor's head as he lay on the couch. A spiral bridge of ascending stairs ran from this pavilion to a much larger pile, where numerous wings and annexes of the same aerial architecture of domes and columns flared from a central edifice, with a circular wall and many thin spires. Below the bridge, about the pavilion, and around the whole edifice above, were gardens of trees and flowers that caused Alvor to recall the things he had seen during his one experiment with hashish. The foliation of the trees was either very fine and hair-like, or else it consisted of huge semi-globular and discoid forms depending from horizontal branches and suggesting a novel union of fruit and leaf. Almost all colors, even green, were shown in the bark and foliage of these trees. The flowers were mainly similar to those Alvor had seen from the pavilion, but there were others of a short, puffy-stemmed variety, with no trace of leaves, and with malignant purple-black heads full of crimson mouths, which swayed a little even when there was no wind. There were oval pools and meandering streams of dark water with irisated glints all through this garden, which, with the columnar edifice, occupied the middle of a small plateau. As Alvor followed his guide along the bridge, a perspective of hills and plains, all marked out in geometric diamonds and squares and triangles, with a large lake or island sea in their midst, was revealed momently. Far in the distance, more than 100 leagues away, were the gleaming domes and towers of some baroque city, toward which the enormous orb of the sun was now declining. When he looked at this sun and saw the whole extent of its diameter for the first time, he felt an overpowering thrill of imaginative awe and wonder and exultation at the thought that it was identical with the red star to which he had addressed in another world the half-lyric, half-ironic lines of his ode. At the end of the spiral bridge they came to a second and more spacious pavilion, in which stood a high table, with many seats attached to it by means of curving rods. Table and chairs were of the same material, a light grayish metal. As they entered this pavilion, 2 strange beings appeared and bowed before Visafmal. They were like the scientist in their organic structure, but were not so tall, and their coloring was very drab and dark, with no hint of opalescence. By certain bizarre indications, Alvor surmised that the 2 beings were of different sexes. "You are right," said Visafmal, reading his thought. These persons are a male and female of the two inferior sexes called abars, who constitute the workers as well as the breeders of our world. There are two superior sexes who are sterile and who form the intellectual, aesthetic, and ruling classes, to whom I belong. We call ourselves the alphads. The abars are more numerous, but we hold them in close subjugation. And even though they are our parents as well as our slaves, the ideas of filial piety which prevail in your world would be regarded as truly singular by us. We supervise their breeding so that the due proportion of abars and alphads may be maintained, and the character of the progeny is determined by the injection of certain serums at the time of conceiving. We ourselves, though sterile, are capable of what you call love, and our amorous delights are more complex than yours in their nature. He now turned and addressed the two abars. The phonetic forms and combinations that issued from his lips were unbelievably different from those of the scholarly English in which he had spoken to Alvor. There were strange gutturals and linguals and oddly prolonged vowels which Alvor, for all his subsequent attempts to learn the language, could never quite approximate, and which argued a basic divergence in the structure of the vocal organs of Visafmal from that of his own. Bowing till their heads almost touched the floor, the two abars disappeared among the columns and wing of the building and soon returned, carrying long trays on which were unknown foods and beverages in utensils of unearthly forms. "Be seated," said Visafmal. The meal that followed was far from unpleasant, and the foodstuffs were quite palatable, though Alvor was not sure whether they were meats or vegetables. He learned that they were really both, for his host explained that they were the prepared fruits of plants which were half animal in their cellular composition and characteristics. These plants grew wild and were hunted with the same care that would be required in hunting dangerous beasts, on account of their mobile branches and the poisonous darts with which they were armed. The two beverages were a pale, colorless wine, with an acrid flavor, made from a root, and a dusky, sweetish liquid, the natural water of this world. Alvor noticed that the water had a saline aftertaste. "The time is now come," announced Visafmal at the end of the meal, "to explain frankly the reason why I have brought you here. We will now adjourn to that portion of my home which you would term a laboratory or workshop, and which also includes my library." They passed through several pavilions and winding colonnades, and reached the circular wall at the core of the edifice. Here a high narrow door, engraved with heteroclitic ciphers, gave admission to a huge room without windows, lit by a yellow glow whose cause was not ascertainable. "The walls and ceiling are lined with a radioactive substance," said Visafmal, "which affords this illumination. The vibrations of this substance are also highly stimulating to the processes of thought." Alvor looked about him at the room, which was filled with alembics and cupels and retorts and sundry other scientific mechanisms, all of unfamiliar types and materials. He could not even surmise their use. Beyond them, in a corner, he saw the apparatus of intersecting bars, with the two heavy discs in which he and Visafmal had made their passage through etheric space. Around the walls there were a number of deep shelves, laden with great rolls that were like the volumes of the ancients. Visafmal selected one of these rolls and started to unfurl it. It was 4 feet wide, was gray in color, and was closely written with many columns of dark violet and maroon characters that ran horizontally instead of up and down. "It will be necessary," said Visafmal, "to tell you a few facts regarding the history, religion, and intellectual temper of our world before I read to you the singular prophecy contained in one of the columns of this ancient chronicle. We are a very old people, and the beginnings or even the first maturity of our civilization antedate the appearance of the lowliest forms of life on your earth. Religious sentiment and the veneration of the past have always been dominant factors among us, and have shaped our history to an amazing extent. Even today, the whole mass of the Abars and the majority of the Alfads are immersed in superstition, and the various details of quotidian life are regulated by sacerdotal law. A few scientists and thinkers, like myself, are above all such puerilities. But strictly between you and me, the Alfads, for all their superior and highly aristocratic traits, are mainly the victims of arrested development in this regard. They have cultivated the Epicurean and aesthetic side of life to a high degree. They are accomplished artists, sybarites, and able administrators or politicians. But intellectually, they have not freed themselves from the chains of a sterile pantheism and an all too prolific hierarchy. Several cycles ago, in what might be called an early period of our history, the worship of all our sundry deities was at its height. There was at this time a veritable eruption, a universal plague of prophets, who termed themselves the voices of the gods, even as similarly minded persons have done in your world. Each of these prophets made his own especial job lot of predictions, often quite minutely worked out and elaborate, and sometimes far from lacking in imaginative quality. A number of these prophecies have since been fulfilled to the letter, which, as you may well surmise, has helped enormously in confirming the hold of religion. However, between ourselves, I suspect that their fulfillment has behind it more or less of a shrewd instrumentality, supplied by those who could profit therefrom in one way or another. There was one vates, Abellechialor by name, who was even more fertile-minded and long-winded than his fellows. I shall now translate to you, from the volumen I've just enrolled, a prediction that he made in the year 299 of the cycle of Sargaloth, the third of the 7 epochs into which our known history has been subdivided. It runs thus. When, for the second time following this prediction, the 2 outmost moons of Sadabor shall be simultaneously darkened in a total eclipse by the 3rd and innermost moon, and when the dim night of this occultation shall have worn away in the dawn, a mighty wizard shall appear in the city of Sarpalaum, before the palace of the kings of Ulfalor, accompanied by a most unique and unheard-of monster, with 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and a white skin. And he that then rules in Ulfalor shall be deposed ere noon of this day, and the wizard shall be enthroned in his place, to reign as long as the white monster shall abide with him. Visafmal paused, as if to give Alvor a chance to cogitate the matters that had been presented to him. Then, while his 3 eyes assumed a look of quizzical sharpness and shrewdness, he continued. Since the promulgation of this prophecy, there has already been 1 total eclipse of our 2 outer moons by the inner one, and, according to all the calculations of our astronomers, in which I can find no possible flaw, a second similar eclipse is now about to take place. In fact, it is due this very night. If Abellechialor was truly inspired, tomorrow morn is the time when the prophecy will be fulfilled. However, I decided some while ago that its fulfillment should not be left to chance, and one of my purposes in designing the mechanism with which I visited your world was to find a monster who could meet the specifications of Abellechialor. No creature of this anomalous kind has ever been known or even fabled to exist in Sadabor, and I made a thorough search of many remote and outlying planets without being able to obtain what I required. In some of these worlds there were monsters of very uncommon types, with an almost unlimited number of visual organs and limbs, but the variety to which you belong with only 2 eyes, 2 arms, and 2 legs, must indeed be rare throughout the infragalactic universe, since I have not discovered it in any other planet than your own. I am sure that you now conceive the project I have long nurtured. You and I will appear at dawn in Sarpalam, the capital of Ulfalar, whose domes and towers you saw this afternoon far off on the plain. Because of the celebrated prophecy and the publicly known calculations regarding the imminence of a second twofold eclipse, a great crowd will doubtless be gathered before the palace of the kings to await whatever shall occur. Achiel, the present king, is by no means popular, and your advent in company with me, who am widely famed as a wizard, will be the signal for his dethronement. I shall then be ruler in his place, even as Abelechilor had so thoughtfully predicted. The holding of supreme temporal power in Ulfalor is not undesirable, even for one who is wise and learned, and above most of the vanities of life, as I am. When this honor has devolved upon my unworthy shoulders, I shall be able to offer you, as a reward for your miraculous aid, an existence of rare and sybaritic luxury, of rich and varied sensation, such as you can hardly have imagined. It is true, no doubt, that you will be doomed to a certain loneliness among us. You will always be looked upon as a monster, a portentous anomaly. But such, I believe, was your lot in the world where I found you, and where you were about to cast yourself into a most unpleasant river. There, as you have learned, all poets are regarded as no less anomalous than double-headed snakes or 5-legged calves. Alvar listened to this speech in manifold and ever-increasing amazement. Toward the end, when there was no longer any doubt concerning Visafmal's intention, he felt the sting of a bitter and curious irony at the thought of the role he was destined to play. However, he could do no less than admit the cogency of Visafmal's final argument. "I trust," said Visafmal, "that I have not injured your feelings by my frankness, or by the position in which I am about to place you." "Oh no, not at all," Alvar hastened to assure him. "In that case, we shall soon begin our journey to Sarpalam, which will take all night. Of course, we could make the trip in the flash of an instant with my space annihilator, or in a few minutes with one of the air machines that have long been employed among us. But I intend to use a very old-fashioned mode of conveyance for the occasion, so that we will arrive in the proper style at the proper time, and also that you may enjoy our scenery and view the double eclipse at leisure." When they emerged from the windowless room, the colonnades and pavilions without were full of a rosy light, though the sun was still an hour above the horizon. This, Alvor learned, was the usual prelude of a Sadaborian sunset. He and Visafmal watched while the whole landscape before them became steeped in the ruddy glow, which deepened through shades of cinnabar and ruby to a rich garnet by the time Antares had begun to sink from sight. When the huge orb had disappeared, the intervening lands took on a fiery amethyst, and tall auroral flames of 100 hues shot upward to the zenith from the sunken sun. Alvor was spellbound by the glory of the spectacle. Turning from this magnificent display to an unfamiliar sound, he saw that a singular vehicle had been brought by the Abars to the steps of the pavilion in which they stood. It was more like a chariot than anything else, and was drawn by 3 animals undreamt of in human fable or heraldry. These animals were black and hairless. Their bodies were extremely long. Each of them had 8 legs and a forked tail, and their whole aspect, including their flat, venomous, triangular heads, was uncomfortably serpentine. A series of green and scarlet wattles hung from their throats and bellies, and semi-translucent membranes, erigible at will, were attached to their sides. "You behold," Visafmal informed Alvor, "the traditional conveyance that has been used since time immemorial by all orthodox wizards in Ulfalor. These creatures are called orpods, and they are among the swiftest of our mammalian serpents." He and Alvor seated themselves in the vehicle. Then the 3 orpods, who had no reins in all their complicated harness, started off at a word of command on the spiral road that ran from Visafmal's home to the plain beneath. As they went, they erected the membranes at their sides and soon attained an amazing speed. Now, for the first time, Alvor saw the 3 moons of Sadabor, which had arisen opposite the afterglow. They were all large, especially the innermost one. A perceptible warmth was shed by their pink rays, and their combined illumination was nearly as clear and bright as that of a terrestrial day. The land through which Visafmal and the poet now passed was uninhabited, in spite of its nearness to Sarpalam, and they met no one. Alvor learned that the terraces he had seen upon awakening were not the work of intelligent beings, as he had thought, but were a natural formation of the hills. Visafmal had chosen this location for his home because of the solitude and privacy, so desirable for the scientific experiments to which he had devoted himself. After they had traversed many leagues, they began to pass occasional houses, of a like structure to that of Visafmal's. Then the road meandered along the rim of cultivated fields, which Alvor recognized as the source of the geometric divisions he had seen from afar during the day. He was told that these fields were given mainly to the growing of root vegetables, of a gigantic truffle and a kind of succulent cactus, which formed the chief foods of the Abars. The Alphats ate by choice only the meat of animals and the fruits of wild half-animal plants, such as those with which Alvor had been served. By midnight the 3 moons had drawn very close together, and the second moon had begun to occlude the outermost. Then the inner moon came slowly across the others, till in an hour's time the eclipse was complete. The diminution of light was very marked, and the whole effect was now similar to that of a moonlit night on earth. "It will be morning in a little more than 2 hours, said Visafmal, "since our nights are extremely short at this time of year. The eclipse will be over before then, but there is no need for us to hurry." He spoke to the orpods, who folded their membranes and settled to a sort of trot. Sarpalam was now visible in the heart of the plain, and its outlines were rendered more distinct as the 2 hidden moons began to draw forth from the adumbration of the other. When to this triple light the ruby rays of the earliest morn were added, the city loomed upon the travelers with fantastic, many-storied piles of that same open type of metal architecture which the home of Visafmal had displayed. This architecture, Alvor found, was general throughout the land, though an older type with closed walls was occasionally to be met with, and was used altogether in the building of prisons and the inquisitions maintained by the priesthoods of the various deities. It was an incredible vision that Alvor saw, a vision of high domes upborne on slender elongated columns, tier above tier of airy colonnades and bridges, and hanging gardens loftier than Babylon or than Babel, all tinged by the ever-changing red that accompanied and followed the Sadaborian dawn, even as it had preceded the sunset. Into this vision, along streets that were paven with the same metal as that of the buildings, Alvor and Visafmal were drawn by the 3 orpods. The poet was overcome by the sense of an unimaginably old and alien and diverse life, which descended upon him from these buildings. He was surprised to find that the streets were nearly deserted, and that little sign of activity was manifest anywhere. A few Abars now and then scuttled away in alleys or entrances at the approach of the orpods, and 2 beings of a coloration similar to that of Visafmal, one of whom Alvor took to be a female, issued from a colonnade and stood staring at the travelers in evident stupefaction. When they had followed a sort of winding avenue for more than a mile, Alvor saw between and above the edifices in front of them the domes and upper tiers of a building that surpassed all the others in its extent. "You now behold the palace of the kings of Ulfalor," his companion told him. In a little while they emerged upon a great square that surrounded the palace. This square was crowded with the people of the city, who, as Visafmal had surmised, were all gathered to await the fulfillment, or non-fulfillment, of the prophecy of Aboletchialor. The open galleries and arcades of the huge edifice, which rose to a height of 10 stories, were also laden with watching figures. Abars were the most plentiful element in this throng, but there were also multitudes of gaily colored alfads among them. At sight of Alvor and his companion, a perceptible movement, a sort of communal shuddering, which soon grew convulsive, ran through the whole assemblage in the square and along the galleries of the edifice above. Loud cries of a peculiar shrillness and harshness arose. There was a strident sound of beaten metal in the heart of the palace, like the gongs of an alarm, and mysterious lights glowed out and were extinguished in the higher stories. Clangors of unknown machines, the moan and roar and shriek of strange instruments, were audible above the clamor of the crowd, which grew more tumultuous and agitated in its motion. A way was opened for the car drawn by the 3 oar-pods, and Visafmal and Alvor were soon at the entrance of the palace. There was an unreality about it all to Alvor, and the discomfiture he had felt in drawing upon himself the weird phosphoric gaze of 10,000 eyes, all of whom were now intent with a fearsome uncanny curiosity on every detail of his physique, was like the discomfiture of some absurd and terrible dream. The movement of the crowd has ceased, while the car was passing along the unhuman lane that had been made for it, and there was an interval of silence. Then, once more, there were babble and debate, and cries that had the accent of martial orders or summonses were caught up and repeated. The throng began to move, with a new and more concentric swirling, and the foremost ranks of Abars and Alfads swelled like a dark and tinted wave into the colonnades of the palace. They climbed the pillars with a dreadful swift agility to the stories above. They thronged the courts and pavilions and arcades, and though a weak resistance was apparently put up by those within, there was nothing that could stem them. Through all this clangor and clamor and tumult, Visafmal stood in the car with an imperturbable mien beside the poet. Soon a number of Alfads, evidently a delegation, issued from the palace and made obeisance to the wizard, whom they addressed in humble and supplicative tones. "A revolution has been precipitated by our advent," explained Visafmal, "and Achiel, the king, has fled. The chamberlains of the court and the high priests of all our local deities are now offering me the throne of Ulfalor. Thus the prophecy is being fulfilled to the letter. You must agree with me that the great Aboletchialor was happily inspired." Chapter 3. The ceremony of Visafmal's enthronement was held almost immediately, in a huge hall at the core of the palace, open like all the rest of the structure, and with columns of colossal size. The throne was a great globe of azure metal, with the seat hollowed out near the top, accessible by means of a serpentine flight of stairs. Alvor, at an order issued by the wizard, was allowed to stand at the base of this globe with some of the Alfads. The enthronement itself was quite simple. The wizard mounted the stairs amid the silence of a multitude that had thronged the hall, and seated himself in the hollow of the great globe. Then a very tall and distinguished-looking Alfad also climbed the steps, carrying a heavy rod, one half of which was green, and the other a swart, sullen crimson, and placed this rod in the hands of Visafmal. Later, Alvor was told that the crimson end of the rod could emit a death-dealing ray, and the green, a vibration that cured almost all the kinds of illness to which the Sadaborians were subject. Thus, it was more than symbolical of the twofold power of life and death with which the king had been invested. The ceremony was now at an end, and the gathering quickly dispersed. Alvor, at the command of Visafmal, was installed in a suite of open apartments on the third story of the palace, at the end of many labyrinthine stairs. A dozen abars, who were made his personal retainers, soon came in, each carrying a different food or drink. The foods were beyond belief in their strangeness, for they included the eggs of a moth-like insect large as a plover, and the apples of a fungoid tree that grew in the craters of dead volcanoes. They were served in ewers of a white and shining mineral, upborne on legs of fantastic length, and wrought with a cunning artistry. Likewise, he was given, in shallow bowls, a liquor made from the blood-like juice of living plants, and a wine in which the narcotic pollen of some night-blooming flower had been dissolved. The days and weeks that now followed were, for the poet, an experience beyond the visionary resources of any terrestrial drug. Step by step, he was initiated, as much as possible for one so radically alien, into the complexities and singularities of life in a new world. Gradually, his nerves and his mind, by the aid of the erubescent liquid which Visafmal continued to administer to him at intervals, became habituated to the strong light and heat, the intense radiative properties of a soil and atmosphere with unearthly chemical constituents, the strange foods and beverages, and the people themselves with their queer anatomy and queerer customs. Tutors were engaged to teach him the language, and, in spite of the difficulties presented by certain unmanageable consonants, certain weird ululative vowels, he learned enough of it to make his simpler ideas and wants understood. He saw Visafmal every day, and the new king seemed to cherish a real gratitude toward him for his indispensable aid in the fulfillment of the prophecy. Visafmal took pains to instruct him in regard to all that it was necessary to know, and kept him well informed as to the progress of public events in Ulfalor. He was told, among other things, that no new news had been heard concerning the whereabouts of Achiel, the late ruler. Also, Visafmal had reason to be aware of more or less opposition toward himself on the part of the various priesthoods, who, in spite of his lifelong discretion, had somehow learned of his free-thinking propensities. For all the attention, kindness, and service that he received, and the unique luxury with which he was surrounded, Alvor felt that these people, even as the wizard had forewarned him, looked upon him merely as a kind of unnatural curiosity or anomaly. He was no less monstrous to them than they were to him, and the gulf created by the laws of a diverse biology, by an alien trend of evolution, seemed impossible to bridge in any manner. He was questioned by many of them, and, in especial, by more than one delegation of noted scientists, who desired to know as much as he could tell them about himself. But the queries were so patronizing, so rude and narrow-minded, and scornful and smug, that he was soon wont to feign a total ignorance of the language on such occasions. Indeed, there was a gulf, and he was rendered even more acutely conscious of it whenever he met any of the female abars or alfads of the court, who eyed him with disdainful inquisitiveness, and among whom a sort of tittering usually arose when he passed. His naked members, so limited in number, were obviously as great a source of astonishment to them as their own somewhat intricate and puzzling charms were to him. All of them were quite nude. Indeed, nothing, not even a string of jewels or a single gem, was ever worn by any of the Sadaborians. The female alfads, like the males, were extremely tall and were gorgeous with epidermic hues that would have outdone the plumage of any peacock, and their anatomical structure was most peculiar. Alvor began to feel the loneliness of which Visafmal had spoken, and he was overcome at times by a great nostalgia for his own world, by a planetary homesickness. He became atrociously nervous, even if not actually ill. While he was still in this condition, Visafmal took him on a tour of Ulfalor that had become necessary for political reasons. More or less incredulity concerning the real existence of such a monstrosity as Alvor had been expressed by the folk of outlying provinces, of the polar realms and the antipodes, and the new ruler felt that a visual demonstration of the two-armed, two-legged, and two-eyed phenomenon would be far from inadvisable to establish beyond dispute the legitimacy of his own claim to the throne. In the course of this tour, they visited many unique cities and rural and urban centers of industries peculiar to Sadabor, and Alvor saw the mines from which the countless minerals and metals used in Ulfalor were extracted by the toil of millions of abars. These metals were found in a pure state and were of inexhaustible extent. Also, he saw the huge oceans, which, with certain inland seas and lakes that were fed from underground sources, formed the sole water supply of the aging planet, where no rain had even been rumored to fall for centuries. The seawater, after undergoing a treatment that purged it of a number of undesirable elements, was carried all through the land by a system of conduits. Moreover, he saw the marshlands at the North Pole, with their vicious tangle of animate vegetation, into which no one has ever tried to penetrate. They met many outland peoples in the course of this tour, but the general characteristics were the same throughout Ulfalor, except in one or two races of the lowest aborigines, among whom there were no alfads. Everywhere the poet was eyed with the same cruel and ignorant curiosity that had been shown in Sarpalam. However, he became gradually inured to this, and the varying spectacles of bizarre interest and the unheard-of scenes that he saw daily helped to divert him a little from his nostalgia for the lost earth. When he and Visafmal returned to Sarpalam, after an absence of many weeks, they found that much discontent and revolutionary sentiment had been sown among the multitude by the hierarchies of the Sadabarian gods and goddesses, particularly by the priesthood of Kunthamosi, the cosmic mother, a female deity in high favor among the two reproductive sexes, from whom the lower ranks of her hierophants were recruited. Kunthamosi was worshipped as a source of all things. Her maternal organs were believed to have given birth to the sun, the moon, the world, the stars, the planets, and even the meteors, which often fell in Sadabor. But it was argued by her priests that such a monstrosity as Alvor could not possibly have issued from her womb, and that therefore his very existence was a kind of blasphemy, and that the rule of the heretic wizard Visafmal, based on the advent of this abnormality, was likewise a flagrant insult to the cosmic mother. They did not deny the apparently miraculous fulfillment of the prophecy of Abelechialor, but it was maintained that this fulfillment was no assurance of the perpetuity of Visafmal's reign, and no proof that his reign was countenanced by any of the gods. "I cannot conceal from you," said Visafmal to Alvor, "that the position in which we both stand is now slightly parlous. I intend to bring the Space Annihilator from my country home to the court, since it is not impossible that I may have need for it, and that some foreign sphere will soon become more salubrious for me than my native one." However, it would seem that this able scientist, alert wizard, and competent king had not altogether grasped the real imminence of the danger that threatened his reign, or else he spoke, as was sometimes his wont, with sardonic moderation. He showed no further concern, beyond setting a strong guard about Alvor to attend him at all times, lest an attempt should be made to kidnap the poet in consideration to the last clause of the prophecy. 3 days after the return to Sarpalom, while Alvor was standing in one of his private balconies looking out over the roofs of the town, with his guards chattering idly in the rooms behind, he saw that the streets were dark with a horde of people, mainly Abars, who were streaming silently toward the palace. A few Alfads, distinguishable even at a distance by their gaudy hues, were at the head of this throng. Alarmed at the spectacle, and remembering what the king had told him, he went to find Visafmal, and climbed the eternal, tortuous series of complicated stairs that led to the king's personal suite. Others among the inmates of the court had seen the advancing crowd, and there were agitation, terror, and frantic hurry everywhere. Mounting the last flight of steps to the king's threshold, Alvor was astounded to find that many of the Abars, who had gained ingress from the other side of the palace, and had scaled the successive rows of columns and stairs with ape-like celerity, were already pouring into the room. Visafmal himself was standing before the open framework of the space annihilator, which had now been installed beside his couch. The rod of royal investiture was in his hand, and he was leveling the crimson end at the foremost of the invading Abars. As this creature leapt toward him, waving an atrocious weapon lined by a score of hooked blades, Visafmal tightened his hold on the rod, thus pressing a secret spring, and a thin, rose-colored ray of light was emitted from the end, causing the Abar to crumple and fall. Others, in no wise deterred, ran forward to succeed him, and the king turned his lethal beam upon them with the calm air of one who is conducting a scientific experiment, till the floor was piled with dead Abars. Still others took their place, and some began to cast their hooked weapons at the king. None of these touched him, but he seemed to weary of the sport, and stepping within the framework, he closed it upon himself. A moment more, and then there was a roar of 1,000 thunders, and the mechanism and Visafmal were no longer to be seen. Never, at any future time, was the poet to learn what had become of him, nor in what stranger world than Sadabor he was now indulging his scientific fancies and curiosities. Alvor had no time to feel, as he might conceivably have done, that he had been basely deserted by the king. All the nether and upper stories of the great edifice were now aswarm with the invading crowd, who were no longer silent, but were uttering shrill, ferocious cries as they bore down the opposition of the courtiers and slaves. The whole palace was inundated with an ever-mounting sea, in which there were now myriads of Alfads as well as of Abars, and no escape was possible. In a few instants, Alvor himself was seized by a group of the Abars, who seemed to have been enraged rather than terrified or discomforted by the vanishing of Visafmal. He recognized them as priests of Kunthamosi by an odd oval and vertical marking of red pigments on their swart bodies. They bound him viciously with cords that were made from the intestines of a dragon-like animal, and carried him away from the palace, among streets that were lined by a staring and gibbering mob, to a building on the southern outskirts of Sarpalom, which Visafmal had once pointed out to him as the Inquisition of the Cosmic Mother. This edifice, unlike most of the buildings in Sarpalom, was walled on all sides, and was constructed entirely of enormous grey bricks, made from the local soil, and bigger and harder than blocks of granite. In a long, 5-sided chamber, illumined only by narrow slits in the roof, Alvor found himself arraigned before a jury of the priests, presided over by a swollen and pontifical-looking Alfad, the Grand Inquisitor. The place was filled with ingenious and grotesque implements of torture, and the very walls were hung to the ceiling with contrivances that would have put Torquemada to shame. Some of them were very small, and were designed for the treatment of special and separate nerves. Others were intended to harrow the entire epidermic area of the body at a single twist of their screw-like mechanism. Alvor could understand little of the charges that were preferred against him, but gathered that they were the same, or included the same, of which Visafmal had spoken, to wit, that he, Alvor, was a monstrosity that could never have been conceived or brought forth by Kuntamosi, and whose very existence, past, present, and future, was a dire affront to this divinity. The entire scene, the dark and lurid room, with its array of hellish instruments, the diabolic faces of the inquisitors, and the high, unhuman drone of their voices as they intoned the charges and brought judgment against Alvor, was laden with a horror beyond the horror of dreams. Presently, the Grand Inquisitor focused a malign gleam of his 3 unblinking orbs upon the poet, and began to pronounce an interminable sentence, pausing a little at quite regular intervals, which seemed to mark the clauses of the punishment that was to be inflicted. These clauses were well nigh innumerable, but Alvor could comprehend almost nothing of what was said. And doubtless it was well that he did not comprehend. When the voice of the swollen Alfaud had ceased, the poet was led away through endless corridors and down a stairway that seemed to descend into the bowels of Sadibor. These corridors, and also the stairway, were luminous with self-emitted light that resembled the phosphorescence of decaying matter in tombs and catacombs. As Alvor went downward with his guards, who were all Abars of the lowest type, he could hear somewhere in sealed, unknowable vaults the moan and shriek of beings who endured the ordeals imposed by the inquisitors of Kuntamosi. They came to the final step of the stairway, where, in a vast vault, an abyss whose bottom was not discernible yawned in the center of the floor. On its edge there stood a fantastic sort of windlass, on which was wound an immense coil of blackish rope. The end of this rope was now tied about Alvor's ankles, and he was lowered head downward into the gulf by the inquisitors. The sides were not luminous like those of the stairway, and he could see nothing. But as he descended into the gulf, the terrible discomfort of his position was increased by sensations of an ulterior origin. He felt that he was passing through a kind of hairy material with numberless filaments that clung to his head and body and limbs like minute tentacles, and whose contact gave rise to an immediate itching. The substance impeded him more and more, till at last he was held immovably suspended as in a net, and all the while the separate hairs seemed to be biting into his flesh with 1,000,000 microscopic teeth, till the initial itching was followed by a burning and a deep convulsive throbbing more exquisitely painful than the flames of the auto da fe. The poet learned long afterward that the material into which he had been lowered was a subterranean organism, half vegetable, half animal, which grew from the side of the gulf with long mobile feelers that were extremely poisonous to the touch. But at the time, not the least of the horrors he underwent was the uncertainty as to its precise nature. After he had hung for quite a while in this agonizing web, and had become almost unconscious from the pain and the unnatural position, Alvor felt that he was being drawn upward. 1,000 of the fine thread-like tentacles clung to him, and his whole body was encircled with a mesh of insufferable pangs as he broke loose from them. He swooned with the intensity of this pain, and when he recovered, he was lying on the floor at the edge of the gulf, and one of the priests was prodding him with a many-pointed weapon. Alvor gazed for a moment at the cruel visages of his tormentors, in the luminous glow from the sides of the vault, and wondered dimly what infernal torture was next to follow, in the carrying out of the interminable sentence that had been pronounced. He surmised, of course, that the one he had just undergone was mild in comparison to the many that would succeed it. But he never knew, for at that instant there came a crashing sound, like the fall and shattering of the universe. The walls, the floor, and the stairway rocked to and fro in a veritable convulsion, and the vault above was riven in sunder, letting through a rain of fragments of all sizes, some of which struck several of the inquisitors and swept them into the gulf. Others of the priests leapt over the edge in their terror, and the two who remained were in no condition to continue their official duties. Both of them were lying beside Alvor with broken heads, from which, in lieu of blood, there issued a glutinous light green liquid. Alvor could not imagine what had happened, but knew only that he himself was unhurt, as far as the result of the cataclysm was concerned. His mental state was not one to admit of scientific surmise. He was sick and dizzy from the ordeal he had suffered, and his whole body was swollen, was blood-red and violently burning from the touch of the organisms in the gulf. He had, however, enough strength and presence of mind to grope with his bound hands for the weapon that had been dropped by one of the inquisitors. By much patience and untiring ingenuity, he was able to cut the thongs about his wrists and ankles on the sharp blade of one of the 5 points. Carrying this weapon, which he knew that he might need, he began the ascent of the subterranean stairway. The steps were half blocked by fallen masses of stone, and some of the landings and stairs, as well as the sides of the wall, were cloven with enormous rents, and his egress was by no means an easy matter. When he reached the top, he found that the whole edifice was a pile of shattered walls, with a great pit in its center, from which a cloud of vapors issued. An immense meteor had fallen and had struck the Inquisition of the Cosmic Mother. Alvor was in no condition to appreciate the irony of this event, but at least he was able to comprehend his chance of freedom. The only inquisitors now visible were lying with squashed bodies whose heads or feet protruded from beneath the large squares of overthrown brick, and Alvor lost no time in quitting the vicinity. It was now night, and only one of the 3 moons had arisen. Alvor struck off through the level arid country to the south of Sarpalam, where no one dwelt, with the idea of crossing the boundaries of Ulfalor into one of the independent kingdoms that lay below the equator. He remembered Visafmal telling him once that the people of these kingdoms were more enlightened and less priest-ridden than those of Ulfalor. All night he wandered in a sort of daze that was at times delirium. The pain of his swollen limbs increased, and he grew feverish. The moonlit plain seemed to shift and waver before him, but was interminable as the landscape of a hashish dream. Presently the other 2 moons arose, and in the overtaxed condition of his mind and nerves, he was never quite sure as to their actual number. Usually there appeared to be more than 3, and this troubled him prodigiously. He tried to resolve the problem for hours as he staggered on, and at last, a little before dawn, he became altogether delirious. He was unable afterward to recall anything about his subsequent journey. Something impelled him to go on, even when his thews were dead and his brain an utter blank. He knew nothing of the waste and terrible lands through which he roamed in the hour-long ruby red of morn, and beneath a furnace-like sun. Nor did he know when he crossed the equator at sunset and entered Homenorion, the realm of the Empress Hambiala, still carrying in his hand the 5-pointed weapon of one of the dead inquisitors. Chapter 4. It was night when Alvor awoke, but he had no means of surmising that it was not the same night in which he had fled from the Inquisition of the Cosmic Mother, and that many Sadaborian days had gone by since he had fallen totally exhausted and unconscious within the boundary line of Homenorion. The warm, rosy beams of the 3 moons were full in his face, but he could not know whether they were ascending or declining. Anyhow, he was lying on a very comfortable couch that was not quite so disconcertingly long and high as the one upon which he had first awakened in Ulfalor. He was in an open pavilion, but this pavilion was also a bower of multitudinous blossoms, which leaned towards him with faces that were both grotesque and weirdly beautiful, from vines that had scaled the columns, or from the many curious metal pots that stood upon the floor. The air that he breathed was a medley of perfumes more exotic than frangipani. They were extravagantly sweet and spicy, but somehow he did not find them oppressive. Rather, they served to augment the deep, delightful languor of all his sensations. As he opened his eyes and turned a little on the couch, a female alfad, not so tall as those of Ulfalor, and really quite of his own stature, came out from behind the flower-pots and addressed him. Her language was not that of the Ulfalorians. It was softer and less utterly unhuman, and though he could not understand a word, he was immediately aware of a sympathetic note or undertone, which, so far, he had never heard on the lips of anyone in this world, not even Visafmal. He replied in the language of Ulfalor, and found that he was understood. He and the female alfad now carried on as much of a conversation as Alvor's linguistic abilities would permit. He learned that he was talking to the Empress Ambiala, the sole and supreme ruler of Amanorian, a quite extensive realm contiguous to Ulfalor. She told him that some of her servitors, while out hunting the wild, ferocious half-animal fruits of the region, had found him lying unconscious near a thicket of the deadly plants that bore these fruits, and had brought him to her palace in Lompior, the chief city of Omanorian. There, while he still lay in a week-long stupor, he had been treated with medicaments that had now almost cured the painful swellings resultant from his plunge among the hair-like organism in the Inquisition. With genuine courtesy, the Empress forbore to question the poet regarding himself, nor did she express any surprise at his anatomical peculiarities. However, her whole manner gave evidence of an eager and even fascinated interest, for she did not take her eyes away from him at any time. He was a little embarrassed by her intent scrutiny, and to cover this embarrassment, as well as to afford her the explanations due to so kind a hostess, he tried to tell her as much as he could of his own history and adventures. It was doubtful if she understood more than half of what he said, but even this half obviously lent him an increasingly portentous attraction in her eyes. All of her 3 orbs grew round with wonder at the tale related by this fantastic Ulysses, and whenever he stopped, she would beg him to go on. The garnet and ruby and cinnabar gradations of the dawn found Alvor still talking, and the Empress Ambiala still listening. In the full light of Antares, Alvor saw that his hostess was, from a Sadaborian viewpoint, a really beautiful and exquisite creature. The iridescence of her coloring was very soft and subtle. Her arms and legs, though of the usual number, were all voluptuously rounded, and the features of her face were capable of a wide range of expression. Her usual look, however, was one of a sad and wistful yearning. This look Alvor came to understand when, with a growing knowledge of her language, he learned that she too was a poet, that she had always been troubled by vague desires for the exotic and the far off, and that she was thoroughly bored with everything in Omanorian, and especially with the male alfads of that region, none of whom could rightfully boast of having been her lover even for a day. Alvor's biological difference from these males was evidently the secret of his initial fascination for her. The poet's life in the palace of Ambiala, where he found that he was looked upon as a permanent guest, was from the beginning much more agreeable than his existence in Ulfalor had been. For one thing, there was Ambiala herself, who impressed him as being infinitely more intelligent than the females of Sarpalaum, and whose attitude was so thoughtful and sympathetic and admiring, in contradistinction to the attitude of those aforementioned females. Also, the servitors of the palace and the people of Lompior, though they doubtless regarded Alvor as a quite singular sort of being, were at least more tolerant than the Ulfalorians, and he met with no manner of rudeness among them at any time. Moreover, if there were any priesthoods in Omenorian, they were not of the uncompromising type he had met north of the equator, and it would seem that nothing was to be feared from them. No one ever spoke of religion to Alvor in this ideal realm, and somehow he never actually learned whether or not Omenorian possessed any gods or hierarchies. Remembering his ordeal in the Inquisition of the Cosmic Mother, he was quite willing not to broach the subject anyway. Alvor made rapid progress in the language of Omenorian, since the Empress herself was his teacher. He soon learned more and more about her ideas and tastes, about her romantic love for the triple moonlight, and the odd flowers that she cultivated with so much care and so much delectation. These blossoms were rare anywhere in Sadabor. Some of them were anemones that came from the tops of almost inaccessible mountains, many leagues in height, and others were forms inconceivably more bizarre than orchids, mainly from terrific jungles near the southern pole. He was soon privileged to hear her play on a certain musical instrument of the country, in which were combined the characters of the flute and the lute. And at last, one day, when he knew enough of the tongue to appreciate a few of its subtleties, she read to him from a scroll of vegetable vellum one of her poems, an ode to a star known as Etana by the people of Omenorian. This ode was truly exquisite, was replete with poetic fancies of a high order, and expressed a half-ironic yearning, sadly conscious of its own impossibility, for the ultra-sidereal realms of Etana. Ending, she added, "I have always loved Etana, because it is so little and so far away." On questioning her, Alvor learned to his overwhelming amazement that Etana was identical with the minute star called Arat in Ulfalor, which Visafmal had once pointed out to him as the sun of his own earth. This star was visible only in the rare interlunar dark, and it was considered a test of good eyesight to see it even then. When the poet had communicated this bit of astronomical information to Ambiala, that the star Etana was his own native sun, and had also told her of his ode to Antares, a most affecting scene occurred, for the Empress encircled him with her 5 arms, and cried out, "Do you not feel as I do, that we were destined for each other?" Though he was a little discomposed by Ambiala's display of affection, Alvor could do no less than assent. The two beings, so dissimilar in external ways, were absolutely overcome by the rapport revealed in this comparing of poetic notes, and a real understanding, rare even with persons of the same evolutionary type, was established between them henceforward. Also, Alvor soon developed a new appreciation of the outward charms of Ambiala, which, to tell the truth, had not altogether intrigued him heretofore. He reflected that, after all, her 5 arms and 3 legs and 3 eyes were merely a superabundance of anatomical features upon which human love was wont to set a by no means lowly value. As for her opalescent coloring, it was, he thought, much more lovely than the agglomeration of outlandish hues with which the human female figure had been adorned in many modernistic paintings. When it became known in Lompior that Alvor was the lover of Ambiala, no surprise or censure was expressed by anyone. Doubtless the people, especially the male alfads who had vainly wooed the empress, thought that her tastes were queer, not to say eccentric. But anyway, no comment was made. It was her own amour, after all, and no one else could carry it on for her. It would seem, from this, that the people of Omanorion had mastered the ultra-civilized art of minding their own business.